So, my name is Arthur Lipovsky. I work as a malware researcher for ESET from Bratislava. I worked there for 9 years, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about the most interesting piece of malware research that I've ever been involved in, BlackEnergy. This is a picture taken from our virus lab, the department where I work in, and it's a room which we call Houston. We process lots of malware samples here, around 300,000 unique binary samples every single day. Now, most of those things are not very interesting. Some of them are, and most of them are troubling regular users, such as this one. This is an example of a recent ransomware called Petya. But every once in a while, we stumble upon something which is really, really interesting and really unique. Raise your hands if this picture looks familiar to you. Anyone? Yeah, I think Stuxnet needs no introduction. The first cyber weapon, the first cyber sabotage attack back in 2010. But that's not the topic of my presentation today. But I'm going to be talking about an event, piece of situation that we've witnessed that was also really significant. That happened on December 23rd of last year. In Ukraine, when people came back from work, sat down in front of their TVs, turned on their favorite television shows, I don't know, maybe it wasn't Big Bang Theory, who knows, maybe it was Ukraine Got Talent. But then sometime at around 5 p.m., the lights went out for over 230,000 people in Ukraine for a couple of hours as a result of a cyber attack, as we later found out. Now, when we discovered this, and as we put together pieces of the puzzle, we wrote some blog posts about it, and obviously this hit the news, and it was a really big thing because nothing like this has ever happened before. It was not documented that a cyber sabotage attack against a mass civilian population like this. So obviously this caused lots of attention. So now that I've told you what happened, we can go home, right? But no, I will go to the very beginning and tell you how we discovered this and how the attack happened. So we actually found out about the power outage on the news, that something went on. A bunch of households in Ukraine, in different regions in Ukraine, went without electricity, because the way the Ukrainian power distribution network works is that there are several regions. Each of them have their own regional electricity distribution company called BlackEnergy company, and several of these companies reported power outages. And then my colleague Anton, he took a look into his logs of some malware families which we are monitoring, and found out that BlackEnergy, something which we've been looking at for the past 2 years, was detected on one of those electricity distribution companies. So that obviously caught our attention, and we started looking further and basically try to determine how the attack happened. So what is this BlackEnergy? I said that we started looking at it in 2014, but the malware itself is actually a lot older. The first version saw the light of day back in 2007, and back then it was used for totally different purposes. It was a really simple denial of service Trojan, sold on underground forums, and then 3 years later, version 2 was created, and that had very little to do with the initial version 1. It was a complete code rewrite. It was still being used for cybercrime, so also for DDoS attacks, also for bank fraud, for example. But this time, the malware was a lot more powerful. It became modular, so the attackers were able to expand its functionality by using plugins and use it for whatever purpose they desired. And then in 2014 was when BlackEnergy started to be used not only for regular cybercrime, but also for cyber espionage. And we detected it we detected attacks against high-value targets in Ukraine against governmental agencies, news agencies, and so on. So we started looking at this gang behind this malware a little bit more. And these attackers, they continued also. They didn't rest on their laurels after the successes they had in 2014, but they continued the attacks and carried out throughout 2015. So let's take a look at the malware itself. I won't go into too many technical details, but just so that you have an understanding of what it's about and what it's capable of doing. So as I explained that it's a cyber espionage toolkit, and it's modular. So the core component, when it's installed on an infected system, it doesn't do much by itself. But the attacker is able to upload individual plugins and expand its functionality. And these are the plugins that actually determine its capabilities. And since it's been used for cyber espionage, so we saw the typical plugins that we expect for cyber espionage malware. There was a file stealing component. There were components for creating screenshots. There was a keylogging component, obviously. There was a component for grabbing various types of system information. There was a password stealer that was able to extract passwords from popular applications, mostly browsers, but also FTP applications and so on. There was also a very interesting plugin that created a backdoor through the legitimate TeamViewer software, which I'm sure many of you know. And it created additional password into the TeamViewer installation. So we'll first check whether TeamViewer was installed or not, and if it was, and if it was being used in that network that they were attacking, so they would create they would use this tool to their advantage and create a backdoor through TeamViewer for the attackers. There was also a plugin for network discovery, because once the attackers found their way inside a target network, they wanted to get to other computers as well, not just that one workstation. And as I'll explain in just a second, this plugin was used quite a lot in the power outage attack. There was also a destructive plugin, which was used when the attackers were finished, when they extracted all the information that they wanted to get, so to cover up their tracks, to delete the files after themselves, and even to make the machines unbootable. So they would wipe system files, they would wipe the master boot record, and so on. There was also a file infector plugin, which was pretty interesting for us as malware researchers from a technical perspective, because today, in the age of Trojans, we don't see that many parasitical viruses as we used to 20, 30 years ago. So to see BlackEnergy using parasitical virus techniques for its spreading, that was something pretty interesting. But it was only one of the many spreading mechanisms that BlackEnergy was using. And there was also a remote desktop plugin, which is provides similar functionality as the TeamViewer backdoor, but through a different mechanism. So it will use the RDP protocol. But BlackEnergy was not the only malware that was detected and used in these attacks by this gang. In our investigation of the electricity distribution company's attacks, we also discovered another piece of malware, which is called Kill Disk, and as you can probably guess from the name, it kills the disk. Metaphorically, well. What this did was that it would delete, again, a bunch of system information, make the system unbootable, but in that particular file, which we found on one server in one of those Obel Energo companies, it was also going specifically after industrial control system processes and SCADA files. So it would make sure that it's not just generally wiping the files after an attack, but that it's specifically on that SCADA system. And it was used in those attacks not only to delete the malware, but also to make the restoration of the power, to turn back on the power after they did that sabotage attack much more difficult. And another component that was discovered was a backdoor SSH server. This was a backdoor put into an SSH utility called Dropbear SSH. Now, if there are any network administrators out there, I think SSH needs no introduction. It's a legitimate protocol used by sysadmins to remotely access servers. But to access those servers legitimately, they have to have the proper credentials to get in. Now, if there are any analysts out there, you can see from this little piece of code disassembly that here it's comparing the password entered with a hard-coded string. So this, again, created another entry point for the attackers into that server belonging to the Obol Energo companies. Okay, so now we know what the malware is capable of. Let's take a look at how it was spreading. And I'll begin with the very first instances when we started looking into this malware family. That was in April 2014. And the spreading mechanism, as is very often the case in similar targeted attacks, was spear phishing. So they would send a spear phishing email to a victim or a would-be victim that they wanted to infect. And they would choose topics which were quite relevant to that victim. So it was not just, the typical mass spreading spam like Nigerian scams, whatever, but it was very, very specifically tailored to that victim. And quite often when we do research, we can also guess from the types of emails, from the wording, from the contents of the emails, as well as the decoy documents that they're showing, who they might be after. And so it was an email. That email contained an attachment. It was an RTF file. That file had a vulnerability in it, an exploit of the CVE 2014-1761 vulnerability. And the topic of the document is not important. It was some controversial text. Again, something that the recipient would be curious to open. Also at the same time, we saw another file used to distribute the BlackEnergy malware. This time the topic was the GlobSec conference held in Bratislava that year. Most probably this attack wave was targeted at the attendees of that conference. A month later, they slightly modified their spreading mechanism. It was, again, spear phishing, but they didn't use exploits this time. They used something much more trivial, and that was just a regular executable camouflaging itself as a Microsoft Word document, since, as we know, Windows hides file extensions by default. So when the victim got this, opened it, thought that they were opening a document, and they actually saw a document because this executable had an embedded decoy within itself, and it opened that. But obviously, in the background, it was running the malicious code. And the file name, by the way, it's in Ukraine is spisok paroli, which means password list. And the topic of this email was the list of the worst passwords to use, to which passwords to avoid. And then in August, we saw the most interesting spreading mechanism used by the BlackEnergy gang. And we discovered a 0-day in PowerPoint. Again, spear phishing. This time, the topic of the email was related to the armed conflict in the east of Ukraine. And it says that the Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the prime minister back then, is instructing all parliament members and other entities to check this list in the attachment, whether anyone in their organization is supporting these rebels, these separatists, these terrorists. So when somebody got this and they opened that attachment, they saw a PowerPoint presentation. And on the second slide, there was a list of some names, the supposed collaborators, terrorist supporters. But what was more important is what was happening in the background. So as you can probably guess, in the background, BlackEnergy was being downloaded and installed, but what's striking here is that it was a 0 day in PowerPoint, and it was PowerPoint that was downloading this without any warning to the user whatsoever. There was no warning about possibly insecure content as expected, as there should be, but this malware was able to be installed by PowerPoint basically invisibly. Then in 2015, the attackers, they started using another pretty interesting technique. This is one of the spear phishing emails from that time. And back down here, you can see that there was supposed to be some image which was supposed to be downloaded from a remote server. And the purpose of this was so that when this email was opened by the email client on the recipient's computer, the email client would try to download this image, and the attacker would get the notification that the recipient opened this email. So it was kind of a read receipt for the attackers. Then in November, there was a very interesting campaign against the largest Ukrainian news agency, and that happened during the local elections at that time. And what they used in this attack was what was also used in the power facility attacks. It was the kill disk component, but this time the kill disk component was slightly different. It wasn't going after SCADA files, but it was going after media files. So it would go through the hard drives on the infected computers and delete any files that match these file extensions. And they would not just delete them, but they would overwrite those files so that they could not be restored. And this led to losses of gigabytes and gigabytes of files. And then that power grid attack that I already mentioned. So that happened in December, but you shouldn't think that it was something which took a couple of days or a week to do. In December, on the 23rd, it was just the culmination of those attacks. In fact, the first emails that we saw that were being sent out to those regional electricity distribution companies were from March 2015. So this was a very well planned, very well orchestrated attack, and the attackers took some time to prepare for this attack. And I'll explain what they were doing in the meantime. There were at least 3 electricity distribution companies which were confirmed that they were under attack, but there were possibly more. And yeah, the power outages were quite massive, up to 230,000 people. And there were also other attacks. Some of them made the news, some of them didn't. There were attacks against the Ukrainian railway, the Kiev International Borispol Airport, and others. And the attacks also continued this year. They even continued after we made some initial releases of our findings. This is one of the attacks, again, against the Ukrainian Oblenergo company. And by this time, their networks were clean. So this was, as you can see, this was an attempt to regain access to their computers again. This time, they again used something slightly modified. So again, spear phishing email, but in the attachment there was a variation of a technique which is pretty old. They were using macro-enabled documents. So, and obviously, since this is an old technique, there are security measures in place. So Microsoft Office protects users from malicious macros, disables them by default. So the attackers would use social engineering, and the text down here says something like, this document was created in a newer version of Office. If you want to see the full content, you have to click Enable Content. So simple. So to sum this all up, we know what the malware was capable of, how it was spreading. So how is it possible that from a spear phishing email over 200,000 people can lose electricity. So yeah, there was that email. And as I said, the first emails started popping up in March, but there were also attack campaigns continued. So we detected the malware. I'll explain what the vulnerabilities were on those systems. Not all of them were protected by AV software, but once they installed AV software on more machines, they scanned, more malware was detected, and once it was cleaned up, the attackers continuously tried to regain access to that network. That's what they were doing from March. So to get in, there was that email. That email contained a document which led to the installation of the BlackEnergy malware. That BlackEnergy contacted its command and control server to download those additional modules that I just talked about. Some of those modules were used for collecting passwords. Some of them were used for crawling around the network because they were trying to get access to those critical machines. They were not interested in the secretary's email box. They were going after domain credentials. And this, obviously, this took some time. So this took months and months of preparation, and once they finally got the access, they were able to remotely access that workstation which was controlling the switch to those hundreds of thousands of users. How is it even possible? How come there are no security mechanisms in place? Well, there were, but it was possible because this was a combination of two things. A very dedicated attacker, we can think of this as the P in the APT, they were very persistent, and a vulnerable target. And they were vulnerable on several occasions. First, the employees were vulnerable to social engineering to open up these emails, and also their systems, they were vulnerable. They were using outdated, unpatched software. Many workstations were using Windows XP. Not all machines were running antivirus software. Even though that there was some logical network segmentation, there were routers in place, there were firewalls and all of this stuff, but there was no physical separation of the network that was connected to the internet and that critical part of the network that had access to the switches. So it was possible for the attackers to steal those, to harvest those credentials, and to get remote access to the systems that they were trying to get to. Also, there was no two-factor authentication used. This is a configuration file from one campaign. This was from back in 2014, but it's just to illustrate how persistent the attackers were. And this was taken from an attack against one Ukrainian governmental institution, as you can see from this gov.ua domain. And what this configuration file says is it's telling the malware the address of the command and control server, how it's supposed to, where it's supposed to call back to the CNC. And since the attackers knew that the workstations didn't have direct access to the internet, but they were behind proxies, so they would access the CNCs through that proxy, through that local proxy. So this illustrates that they had to know what the network topology in that environment was, and this was similar to the case in the power attacks. So that is the story of BlackEnergy, the first cyber warfare campaign with a massive effect on civilians. Now, think for a moment what losing power due to a cyber attack means. It's not just your mother not being able to finish her soap operas or series. Thank you.